In the middle of the night, she killed him, her own son, got in her car with his body, drove to a dumpster, and threw him away like a piece of trash.
This case can't be decided based on emotions. It has to be decided on facts and evidence presented in this courtroom.
Good evening. Thanks for joining us for this special newscast of B News at 7. I'm Dawn Baker. Our Haley Boland is out live in the field tonight discussing everything we have learned about the Leilani Simon murder trial. She's the mother accused of killing her toddler, Quinton Simon, and throwing him into a dumpster 2 years ago. This case has been at the center of the Chatham County community for years now. Judge Tammy Stokes swore in the jury for the first time this morning after all 12 were selected on Friday. The prosecution and defense gave their opening statements, and the state called their first few witnesses to the stand. Tonight, our live team coverage continues. Haley, walk us through the day in court.
Yeah, good evening, Dawn. A big day in court here in Chatham County as the trial of Leilani Simon is officially underway. I'm joined here by WTOC's Flynn Snyder and Shay Schrader, who have been in the courtroom all day today. Now, today is important because it was opening statements, so we started to really get a picture of what this trial will look like over the next week or two. So I do want to ask you guys were in that courtroom today. What are your key takeaways from day one?
Yeah, I think there's really a lot to talk about. Opening statements, one thing that surprised me was how lengthy it was. It lasted for a little under 2 hours, I want to say. Most of that time was taken up by the prosecution, laying out a really detailed timeline of what they say happened the night that Quinton disappeared. But what really stood out to me more than that was the inclusion in their timeline of the intrinsic evidence. Now, they had had hearings on this before the trial actually started, asking the judge if they could include evidence that gave a window into what Leilani Simon's life was like at the time that Quinton disappeared, including turmoil in her relationships and what they characterize as a less loving relationship with Quinton than her other children. And that took up a lot of their opening statement. And as we were discussing earlier, Flynn, if that evidence had not been allowed, those opening statements would not have been as lengthy.
Yeah, that's right. And on the flip side of that, you talk about the defense's opening statement as well and how short it was in comparison to the prosecution. I believe Robert Purse, Leilani Simon's defense attorneys, one of them got up right after the prosecution finished their opening statements and said, well, I'm not going to talk for as nearly as long as they did, and basically kept it short and sweet, saying, look, they're going to say a lot of things about emotion and feeling in this case, but the defense says what the prosecution is really lacking here is hard evidence. There's really no evidence that the defense believes here, and they're saying that really what matters is the evidence that's admissible in court and what the jurors will hear, and they have to decide on that alone, not based off of emotions, but based off of what they hear in court. So you really got a sense of not only what the prosecution is going to lay out over the next couple weeks in this trial, but also what the defense is how they're going to attack this as well.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So they did bring up in opening statements today, the prosecution showed a 4-minute long video of Leilani Simon with a very emotional statement as far as where she was at in the months leading up to Quinton's death. I want you to take a listen to that, and we'll talk on the other side of this break.
Mama tried. Your mama's not here no more because she doesn't love you. I do. I can't love myself. If I can't love myself, how can I love y'all?
Now, clearly, the prosecution is trying to portray a sense of desperation in Leilani in those months and weeks leading up to Quinton's death. So, Flynn, how do you see that playing out throughout the rest of this trial?
Well, Haley, this particular video was one of the pieces of evidence at the center of last week's motion hearing, where Judge Stokes basically decided what types of evidence are going to be allowed and not going to be allowed. At that point in last week's motion hearing, one of the assistant district attorneys, Jenny Parker, on the case got up and said, we are trying to show Leilani as, and I believe the quote was, a desperately unhappy woman in the weeks and months leading up to Quinton Simon's death. They are trying to put in evidence about Leilani's fraught relationship with her boyfriend at the time, and used that to show how increasingly sad and lonely and isolated she felt. And it was really interesting that the judge let that into the trial and admissible in front of the jurors, because the prosecution was really trying to show that, give a sense of Leilani's mindset in those weeks before. I believe in the motion hearing last week, they said that video was taken 2 months before October 5th, which is when investigators say Quinton Simon died. So it was just an interesting glimpse into what prosecutors say Simon's mindset was leading up to Quinton's death.
Now, Flynn, going off of that, today was really the first time that we got a full timeline of what that day that they believe Quinton died is, that those early morning hours of October 5th. The prosecution laying that out today. Here's what they had to say.
And she pulls into this mobile home plaza. It's right here. Mostly what you're seeing is trees, but there are mobile homes in here. This is Azalea Mobile Home Plaza. And there's a convenient standard dumpster sort of hidden away under some tree cover in the tree line there. And she throws Quinton's body away like a piece of trash at about 1:17 in the morning.
Now, again, the prosecution today arguing that Leilani disposed of Quinton's body around 1 a.m. that morning of October 5th. But they also tried to poke a few holes in her story today that she was telling investigators in those days that Quinton was missing. So, Shay, is there anything that stands out to you as far as Leilani's story and the holes they were trying to poke in it?
Yeah, I mean, the state laid out, exactly what they say is a story that she concocted about what her whereabouts were that night. They said that she went to the Azalea Mobile Home Park around 1 o'clock in the morning to dispose of Quinton's body. She'd originally told investigators that she went to bed at midnight and she wasn't up again until, almost 6 a.m. when she noticed that Quinton was missing. Investigators say that that's not the case. They say that they have evidence that she went to the Circle K at the intersection of Ogeechee Road and Veterans Parkway to get some items, and after that she actually went down on Highway 204 to meet her drug dealer. She didn't tell them about that at all at first. When they questioned her about that, she said, oh, well, I did meet my drug dealer, but it wasn't to buy drugs. It was to pay off an existing drug debt. Then they get cell phone data, showing that she's in the area of Azalea Mobile Home Park, and she, the state says, concocted a story that she went to the parking lot of a Chevron station that's right next to the mobile home park to get Oragel from a friend that she used to work with. The crux of this being the day before Quinton was reported missing, she left her shift at work to go get oral surgery, and so an overlying theme of this entire thing is that she was going through mouth pain at the time, and so she said that all the stores were closed. She called the Circle K and they didn't have Oragel, so she said she went to meet a friend in the Chevron parking lot to get Oragel, but the state says that the police actually went to interview this friend that she supposedly met up with, and the friend said that she hadn't seen Simon in months. And when the police department confronted her about that, she kept with her story. But of course, they have the cell phone data and they have all that location data, and they were able to just dismantle that.
Gotcha. Now, after opening statements today, the state did call their first witnesses in the trial, again, after the conclusion of those opening statements. Now, one of those was a CCPD, a Chatham County police officer, who was one of the first ones on scene. Now, they say that this officer actually did say today that he believes that Leilani did not act and behave in the way that other people that he's dealt with who have missing children did. Take a listen to what he had to say.
Most of the time when we get to a residence where a child is missing, mother's upset. She's hysterical. She's crying. She's telling us, what are you standing here for, talking to me? You should be out looking for my child. You're wasting time. And they're so hysterical, a lot of times you can't talk to them.
Was the defendant like that in this case?
No, sir.
Did you view her demeanor as consistent with that of other parents that you've spoken to in missing children cases?
No, sir, I didn't.
Meanwhile, the defense used this same investigator to argue that the crime scene wasn't properly secured. Here's what the defense had to say.
And wouldn't securing that scene mean you prevent people from going in or out?
That's correct.
Okay. Wouldn't it also mean that when you send techs in to go ahead and secure or look or search or do something like that, they would actually be wearing gloves or have some sort of bodysuit on? so they would not contaminate the scene.
Yeah, so you talking about the officers that went in and searched?
Talking about all of the officers that were out there. It seemed like you had an ungodly amount of people out there that day.
Now, the testimony today stemming from law enforcement officers who were the first on scene. They're really getting into the weeds of those first few hours being on the scene there on Buckhalter Road. What are your main takeaways from the testimony as well?
I think the amount of people that were on the scene, that was something that the sergeant really talked about, is the fact that in these missing children's cases, they have everybody from the department, everybody that they can spare from other departments that they can call in to get on this, and they typically call in the FBI because they truly thought from the beginning that it was an abduction case. But it became clear from the sergeant's testimony that they knew that something may have been afoul pretty early on by what he said. The demeanor of Leilani Simon when she first made contact with the police, he said that she was not hysterical in the way that other mothers with missing children have been, and he said that he's been on dozens and dozens of missing children's cases, and this one stood out to him.
Yeah, and this kind of starts to unpack a crucial point of what prosecutors say their case is going to be, is how a mother in that situation should act, and how they say that Simon was not acting in that way. So you talk about demeanor, and it also kind of got into timeline a little bit, right? That first initial questioning of Leilani Simon, and when investigators in the early days and the early hours started getting that traffic data back of, hey, well, Simon's car was out in the early morning hours, late into October 4th into October 5th, and then then they start pressing her on her story a little bit. So it really goes to show in the witness's testimony of how the prosecution plans to unpack a lot of what was said in the opening statements today.
All right, Flynn Snyder, Shay Schrader, thank you so much for your time. Stick with us. We are joined by a criminal defense attorney, that's Jonah Pine, for some legal analysis on this first day of this trial. So stick with us. We'll be right back on the News at 7.
I wake up or days that something so little just might happen. It's like a trigger. And it's not.
Tonight on this special edition of The News at 7, second day of testimony for the murder trial of Leilani Simon. She's the Chatham County mother accused of killing her son Quinton and throwing him in a dumpster 2 years ago. Today we've seen more of the state's witnesses take the stand, detailing what they saw and the interactions they had with the defendants. Good evening and thanks for joining us for The News at 7. I'm Dawn Baker. Our Haley Boland is live out in the field again tonight. Haley, good evening.
Yeah, good evening, Dawn. Another busy day in Chatham County Court here as we were in day 2 of testimony in the trial of Leilani Simon. Now, we heard from a lot of the state's witnesses today, including the lead detective on the case. But I want to get straight to our Shay Schrader and Flynn Snyder. You guys were in the courtroom all day again today. Now, what are your main takeaways from day 2?
Yeah, there was a lot of compelling testimony today from some of the main detectives on the case from the Chatham County Police Department, but I want to talk a little bit about the environment in the courtroom. As I'm sure many of our viewers out there remember, there was an intense public interest in this case, particularly while the police department was searching for Quinton's remains and Leilani Simon was named as a suspect. There was a lot of interest from true crime YouTubers, people that were just invested in this story in the community. The courtroom has been essentially empty. There have not been very many people in there at all, and that includes Simon's family members. We haven't really seen anybody there to support her except for her grandfather, who was there for a short time yesterday. Some of this could be because they could be potential witnesses on a witness list, but I've been kind of surprised just to see how empty the courtroom has been.
Yeah, for me, the main takeaway from today was just the amount of evidence that prosecutors kind of threw at the jurors. The day started out with more than 100 plus photo exhibits of Leilani Simon's home on October 5th that was photographed by Chatham County police officers who responded to the scene. And then the second half of the day was hours long video playing back of recorded interviews between Leilani Simon and police. So prosecutors really threw a lot at jurors today as far as hundreds of pictures, hours of video recording, and it's only day 2.
That's absolutely right. And the lead detective, Marion Lemons, spent a lot of time on the stand today going through a lot of the interviews that she conducted with Leilani Simon in the days after Quinton Simon went missing. Now, the prosecution obviously using some of these hours-long interviews to portray how emotional Leilani was in these days. Here's a clip of that right now.
There's a lot of reasons why I've been
Now, the prosecution also used this as an opportunity to show how unpredictable and inconsistent Leilani could be when talking to law enforcement officers. Take a listen.
Was her demeanor consistent throughout any given interview?
Absolutely not.
Can you tell us why you say that?
I mean, as we saw in this interview, she would kind of get into these hysterical, yelling rants.
And would that happen in response to any particular lines of questioning?
Sometimes when it kind of questioned her statement or her timeline, it would start to escalate into this.
Now, Flynn, how important do you think it is to the prosecution's argument to show these inconsistencies in Leilani's story throughout this trial?
Crucial, Haley. I mean, this interaction with Leilani Simon and detectives there in that interview really plays into the prosecutor's theory of devolving lies that Simon told investigators about her drug use and her whereabouts in the hours leading up to Quinton Simon's death. And you heard Detective Lemons there on the stand today, and the quote was, Simon would go into these hysterical yelling rants that, investigators would kind of have to calm her down from whenever they would really kind of press her on the timeline that she was giving them in the hours after they first responded to their home on October 5th. So, it really plays into the lies that prosecutors say Simon was telling investigators, but also her mindset and how worked up she got very easily too in those interviews. Two things that prosecutors say are central into their thinking as to why Leilani Simon killed her toddler Quinton. The only question here, Haley, is how much jurors are actually picking up of this, right? Like we said, hours-long video today. At one point, Judge Stokes had to stop the proceedings to say, hey, we need to take a break because one juror actually looks sleepy here, and had to remind the jurors to kind of stay active and present and acknowledge that some of this evidence might be hard to digest given the length of time it is. So I think it kind of runs a risk of, boring some jurors essentially, but also it's crucial, prosecutors feel like, evidently, to show these interviews in almost their entirety, to kind of show the swings that Simon would go through between answering questions and then these, like Detective Lemon would say, hysterical yelling rants.
Yeah, and in some of what was brought up today that Leilani had told investigators was Henry Moss. Now, that is Quinton Simon's biological father. Now, Leilani did tell investigators that Henry had threatened her via Facebook, and Detective Lemons did say that they weren't able to find any evidence of that. Here's a listen to what she had to say.
She was describing Henry Moss's Facebook account that they had been communicating, and that he had been saying that he was going to take Quinton after he gets a paternity test.
And she was saying those messages had been sent when in relation to this interview?
I believe those specific ones she said a few weeks prior.
Okay. Now, did you look in her phone that day?
I did.
And were you able to see any messages along those lines in her Facebook?
No.
Now, Shay, what do you think of the inclusion of Quinton's father today? What do you think this establishes?
I think it's really important. First, the Chatham County Police Department was treating this like an abduction case, which we do know real child abduction cases are fairly rare, but when they do occur, it's almost always somebody that's close to the child, and so this is a natural avenue for them to go down. Now, their accusation is that Leilani Simon, made up these Facebook messages, and probably in an effort to kind of point the finger towards the father of Quinton. I think that that's the case that they're trying to make here, and just establish, these falsehoods that she's trying to point the finger in so many different directions and never at herself. I think it's important to note that she had said in other interviews that Quinton's father was not in his life, that she hadn't talked to him for, I believe she said, over a year in one of those interviews to this point. She'd had very little contact with him. At one point she said that her then fiance, Daniel Youngkin, knew what Henry Moss looked like, but Moss would not have known what Youngkin looked like. That was how much contact they really didn't have. Another point that the prosecution has tried to make is that Leilani didn't have as close of a relationship with Quinton as she did her other children, and they believe that that stemmed from her frayed relationship with Quinton's father, who by all other accounts had never even attempted to have any contact with him. So, you know, the assertion that he all of a sudden would be sending her Facebook messages and, you know, essentially threatening to abduct him or take him away, that's a story that the prosecution in the state have very easily been able to kind of put a hole in.
Gotcha. And something else that stands out today is Leilani acknowledging her own mental health challenges, you know, even admitting to snapping in the past. Now, here's a listen into an interview with law enforcement and her.
I'm a completely different person. The way I talk, the way I move, the way I look at you, everything, even my tone of voice. Can you feel that happening? Yeah. Where it's like, when it happens, I have finally reached a certain level of anger or stress or whatever it might be at that moment, that it's like a switch.
Now, this question is for both of you. I mean, what impact do you think it has on the trial to have Leilani really admitting to this in her own words, her mental health challenges?
This could have a great impact on the jurors. You know, the prosecution has said they do lack physical evidence of how Quinton actually died, and so what they have very clearly been trying to do is establish her erratic behavior and her emotional turmoil around the time that Quinton disappeared, and her, by her own admittance, that she can get to an anger level where she snaps. It's not a good look, and, you know, to the jury could play into this idea that she could have gotten so angry that she did the unthinkable. There was also the clip yesterday that they played where she admitted that when she's on cocaine, she became also angry and impulsive, and all of these things are playing into the prosecution's case, which is she could become so emotional that she lost control of herself. And this really does demonstrate their point.
Yeah, and the amount of time that the prosecution played these videos for jurors today, it kind of was like, well, hey, see for yourself, guys. You know, I think, again, we hear so much about Leilani Simon's demeanor and how she should be acting, you know, in a situation where a mother whose child is missing. And I think prosecutors really wanted to point to how volatile she can be, right? As Shay said, you know, calm 1 minute, and then as soon as she's pressed on the timeline, goes into these hysterical rants. So I think they wanted jurors to see that, you know, instead of prosecutors or a witness kind of testifying to that, just kind of play these videos in essentially their entirety uninterrupted and just let jurors see for themselves.
All right, Flynn Snyder, Shay Schrader, thank you so much for your time today. You guys will be back in the courtroom tomorrow, and stick with us on the news at 7 after the break we're about to take. I'll be joined by Jonah Pine, a Savannah criminal defense attorney, to give us some legal analysis on day 2 of testimony. Stick with us.
I didn't look. I wish I looked.
Tonight, our special edition of The News at 7 continues with emotional testimony for day 3 of the Leilani Simon murder trial. For the first time, we heard from her ex-boyfriend, Danny, testifying that what happened the day little Quinton Simon went missing. We also will delve into more of the FBI's interviews as they question Leilani Simon. Leilani is the Chatham County mother accused of killing her 20-month-old toddler 2 years ago and throwing him in a dumpster. Our Haley Boland is once again live out in the field with our Flynn Snyder and Shay Schrader, and they have a lot to get through. Haley, good evening.
Yeah, good evening, Dawn. Today is the first time in this trial that we're really hearing from people who are close to Leilani Simon. Like you mentioned, Daniel Youngkin, her ex-boyfriend, took the stand today. Now, of course, I'm joined here by Flynn Snyder and Shay Schrader. Daniel Youngkin made it clear today that he is corroborating with law enforcement since pretty early on in the investigation. Take a listen.
Did the FBI propose to you that they put you up in a hotel room and that they wired that hotel room up for audio and video?
Yes, sir.
And did they tell you why it was that they wanted to do that?
Yes, sir.
What was it? What was the reason for this?
To collect evidence against Leilani.
Now, Daniel Youngkin is the father of Leilani's youngest child, and he was living in the home at the time that Quinton went missing. So you guys, again, were in the courtroom all day today. What stands out to you about Danny's testimony?
It was honestly a little bit of a shock to see him at the stand. Not that we didn't expect him to testify, but just the act of seeing him and hearing him speak about this for the first time. Since the very beginning of the case, he's been central to it in pretrial motion hearings and things of that nature. Him and his relationship with Leilani Simon have been mentioned, but we've only seen or experienced his perspective through her lens. Text messages that she sent him, accounts of his behavior. This is the first time that we're hearing from him and really seeing from him about what the environment in the home was, and the fact that he was collaborating with law enforcement by allowing them to essentially bug a hotel room, and he invited Leilani in.
Yeah, and that collaboration coming very early on in the investigation, only a couple days after Quinton was reported missing, did Youngkin agree to having their hotel room essentially bugged and prosecutors listening in on it. And what you saw during that exchange in the hotel room between Simon and Youngkin is that Simon stuck to her gun. She did not change her story, even when Youngkin kind of leveled with her and said, hey, look, boyfriend to girlfriend, just tell me what happened. And Simon was essentially said, look, I don't want to talk to you about what other people think happened. I want to know happened. And she kind of had that same, hysterical demeanor that she had with prosecutors with Youngkin whenever he kind of pressed her about what exactly did happen. It's also, he's also a very key witness, right? Prosecutors say that Simon and Youngkin's fraught relationship was one of the personal stressors that ultimately drove Simon to kill her toddler, Quinton. So very important witness, but also very important testimony from Youngkin today on the stand.
Yeah, and we had a lot of important evidence here in today's trial as well. The state called an FBI forensic anthropologist to the stand today to go over some of Quinton's remains. Now, again, these are primarily bones that are what's left and being analyzed here. Here's what she had to say on the stand today.
Is it fair to say that you essentially cannot tell whether any of the trauma to the bones was incurred before this child died versus after?
I can tell that the fractures didn't occur before the time of death because there's no signs of that active healing. So the fractures either occurred around the time of death or after.
Now, essentially, this testimony did not help establish a cause of death here. So, Shay, what impact do you think that has on the case?
We didn't expect them to be able to establish a cause of death. That's something that the prosecution has been very upfront about from the very beginning. But what this does show is that his remains were in very poor condition. And even hearing it is different than seeing the photos. They were a little bit shocking, seeing Quinton's remains. And I believe that Ms. Christensen's testimony about not being able to tell when some of the injuries happened, particularly talking about a fracture in the remains of Quinton's skull, there's no telling if that injury occurred right before he died or if it could have been a result of the trash compaction process, if it was something that happened, while his remains were in the landfill. But something that I find interesting is the indictment specifically mentions that the state believes that Leilani beat him with an unspecified object, with that leading to his death. She didn't mention that in her testimony, and that hasn't been mentioned at all in the trial so far. So it'll be interesting to see if they bring in any other experts or any other witnesses that are going to be able to let the jury know where that specific line in the indictment came from and where this idea that she beat him to death came from.
I gotcha. And in addition to this forensic evidence, they're also continuing to sift through a lot of the digital evidence in this trial as well. That includes text messages as well as a web search from Leilani Simon herself. They did bring up a concerning search that she conducted on her iPhone just a few days before Quinton went missing. Take a listen to that.
When was it conducted?
October 1st of 2022 at 1:10 a.m.
And it says on here that the source is Safari.
Yes.
What is Safari?
An internet browser.
And can you read into the record the text of that search?
Yes. Is it common for a mother to have resentment or even anger towards her child because of the father or another reason?
Now, again, this mention of resentment toward her children. Now, Flynn, what do you think this says about Leilani's mindset in the days leading up to Quinton's disappearance?
Yeah, and prosecutors are trying to point to resentment, not all of her children, but specifically Quinton in this case. In a lot of the pretrial motions, prosecutors were trying to make the argument and let this type of evidence into trial to basically say that Leilani had resentment towards Quinton's father and, by extension, Quinton. And we, in the pretrial motions, saw a lot of Leilani's former friends, babysitter testify that Leilani Simon treated Quinton differently than the rest of her two children. So that was one of the angles that prosecutors were trying to get at as far as possibly the why behind why they believe Simon killed her toddler. And it also, like you said, shows mindset at the time, right? How she was feeling about her son and also her son's father. So it really did get into mindset, where she was kind of thinking in the days leading up to Quinton's death.
Absolutely. And something else that's been a major part of this trial so far have been the continued interviews with Leilani in those days directly after Quinton's disappearance. We've sifted through, what would you guys say, hours at this point of Leilani's interviews with law enforcement. And one that was brought up today was one of the interviews she did with an FBI agent in those days following the disappearance that really pressed her on that timeline and caused some frustration. Take a listen.
It doesn't add up. It really doesn't. It's because there's a piece of the puzzle missing, but it's not me. It's you. It's not. It's absolutely. It is not me. It is absolutely. No. And you can repeat that over and over and over again. It doesn't make it true. It's just not me.
Now, it's clear the prosecution is going to continue to try to point out these inconsistencies in Leilani's story, as well as pitching her as rather unstable. What are your takeaways from kind of the prosecution's arguments overall today, as well as the continued themes we expect to see throughout the rest of this trial, Shay?
Yeah, I think it's interesting just how hard they're hitting the inconsistencies in her story, and I think that they're doing this again because of the lack of physical evidence, and they really need to drive the point home to the jury that she's the only person in this case that seems to not be cooperating and having a different story. Now, she came up with the Oragel story, according to the prosecution, that she had gone to the Chevron to meet her friend for Oragel. She stuck with that even after they told her that they had interviewed her friend, who denied having even seen her for months. We do know from days of previous testimony that eventually she said, I did go to the dumpster at Azalea Mobile Home Plaza. It's because I had spoiled food in a trash bag in the car that she shared with Daniel Youngkin and threw it away. I thought it was really interesting today. The jury had already heard that bit of testimony, and today the prosecution questioned Daniel, have you ever left bags of spoiled food in your car? And he seemed kind of taken aback and almost confused as to why they would be asking such a question, and he said, no, it would be really stinky. I thought that was a really interesting move by the prosecution.
Yeah, and also just pushing back to Youngkin's testimony there today too, that he seemed skeptical even of Simon's first initial statements to police on October 5th, the day that Quinton was reported missing. I believe on the stand today, his reaction to Simon's first statements was kind of like, what the heck, what are you talking about? And as for the FBI interview that we saw today, I mean, that was really the first time that we saw an investigator involved in this case really press Simon about her statements regarding her timeline and where she was at in the hours before Quinton was reported missing. I mean, and the FBI agent, it was also the first time that they really suggested that Simon knew what happened to Quinton and was not being truthful with investigators. I mean, the FBI agent explicitly said that, saying something along the lines of, like, you know, sometimes things happen that we don't mean for them to, and hey, look, you couldn't protect Quinton then, but you can protect him now and help us, you know, figure out what exactly happened here. And like you said, Haley, you know, Simon just becomes frustrated and hysterical once she gets pressed on those timelines. So the pressing and the kind of pushback that investigators gave to Simon about that timeline was really striking today as well.
Well, Flynn Snyder, Shay Schrader, thank you so much for your time today. Court resumes tomorrow at 9 a.m., but stick with us here on this special edition of The News at 7. I'll be joined by Jonah Pine, criminal defense attorney, to give us some more legal analysis on day 3 of testimony. Stick with us. Yeah, good evening, Dawn. Today in Chatham County Court, by far had some of the most dramatic testimony we've seen so far in this trial, with some of Leilani's family members and even a former neighbor taking the stand today. Now I'm joined by Shay Schrader and Flynn Snyder again today. Now that former neighbor testified on the stand that she believes that there was some aggression towards Quinton that Leilani had. Take a listen.
I guess he was doing something like climbing on the table, and she told him to get down several times, and she's like, this is why I wish I never had you, wish I would have aborted you.
What you've talked about to this point, would you characterize it as verbal abuse?
Yes, and I've heard her whip them, but I can't, like I said, I mean, it's whoopings, so I don't know if she's using her hand on their butt. I don't know what she's using. It's on the phone call.
Now, the defense quickly tried to discredit this witness. She said on the stand today she had had previous interactions with the ghost of Quinton Simon. Take a listen to that.
So he was a 15-month-old ghost speaking to you. Please tell me about this. I would love to hear it.
Okay, so this is what I did, and I lit my candle, had my Bible out, and I prayed. I asked if I could reach out to Quinton Simon. He said, "Mommy hurt me." I asked him, how did he hurt you? Or how did she hurt you, sorry. And he told me, she hit me in the head really hard.
Now, again, this is by far some of the most dramatic and relatively colorful testimony we've heard so far. Now, this question is for both of you. How do you think this witness will come into play for the jury?
Well, Haley, this was Melanie Bowling on the stand just there. It was a former friend of Leilani Simon's. They used to live close to each other when the two lived out in Glenville. And Bowling's testimony was one of those witnesses who was kind of in question at last week's motion hearing. She took the stand last week as well, away from jurors. Her testimony was fiery then, and it was fiery now today when she talked about some of the things that she overheard Simon say about Quinton then, and also some of the more bizarre aspects of her testimony, like having a seance with Quinton's ghost. It will be interesting to see kind of what the jury takes away from this today. I mean, in some cases, she did give quite compelling, at times salacious details about the nature of Simon's and Quinton's relationship. But at the same time, you also saw the defense on cross-examination today kind of attack her credibility a little bit. Of course, one with that seance comment there, and the prosecution having to kind of course correct a little bit and say, well, you know, that testimony isn't admissible, and we understand that not everybody believes in communication with spirits. But you also heard her say, too, that, you know, she never actually met Quinton Simon in person, and that was something that the defense kind of leapt on there in a way to kind of attack her credibility with the jurors.
Yeah, she said that she had only ever heard Quinton, you know, through FaceTime, on the phone, things like that. So she had never actually met him, knew his character or anything like that. And so it's going to be interesting to me how this is going to reflect onto the jury and what they're going to think of this. I think it's an interesting move by the prosecution to put her on the stand, knowing full well that she's going to say these things that she said about the seance and the ghost, because there could be jurors on there that think she says these kinds of bizarre things. What if that means everything else that she said is not true or is not credible? But this is something that both the prosecution and the defense were aware of going into this on the voir dire, the questions that they asked the jurors. There were questions on there pertaining to whether potential jurors believed in things like seances and psychics, and so they knew who they were looking for on either side of the aisle.
Now, this was briefly touched on with this witness, but the prosecution was also trying to establish a pattern of physical abuse against Quinton while he was still alive. Again, that abuse by Leilani, allegedly. Now, they did bring forth the daughter of the family's babysitter in court to the stand today, and she had an encounter where she says she saw Leilani push Quinton. Now, again, a note for our viewers, this witness is a minor, so we're unable to show her face, but take a listen to what she had to say.
I was fixing to go grab Quinton to put him in there, but instead of her listening to me tell her, hold on, let me get his floaty on, she just full on pushed him in the pool.
Was he able to swim at this point?
No, sir.
What happened once he was pushed into the pool?
He went underwater, and when he came back out, he caught his breath, trying to catch his breath, and then he started crying.
Was he coughing or anything?
Yes, sir.
And how did Leilani react to that?
She said she really didn't care because if Zane could learn how to swim, then Quinton needed to be as smart as Zane.
Now, today was one of the first times we really saw some testimony about physical abuse against Quinton. Shay, what effect do you think that has on this case?
This has been some of the most emotional testimony that we've seen so far. No matter how you slice it up, it's hard to listen to allegations of abuse against a child that was so young and by all accounts so happy. So that's likely going to leave an impression on the jurors. And what's interesting is that this is coming from somebody that investigators on the case described more as a second family to Quinton, not so much a babysitter. So this is somebody that he spent a lot of time with, that she said kind of viewed him as a friend. She viewed him as somebody that she was able to play with and make happy when he came over. So that emotion coming into the case really for the first time, I think, is going to have an impact on the jurors. However, we did also see Quinton's pediatrician and cardiologist on the stand today. The pediatrician noting that she was a mandated reporter, meaning any child that comes to her office, if she had any suspicion that they were victims of abuse, she would have to report that. And she said that she did not have any suspicions of that with Quinton, and so therefore she never reported any physical abuse. So you kind of have these two differing accounts here, although one of those is from the perspective of a pediatrician that I believe she said saw him once versus somebody that was around him almost every single day.
Yes, and we also heard from Melissa Bray today on the stand. Now, she's the woman who Leilani Simon references heavily in her alibi. She says that she met her that night, the night that Quinton went missing, and today, Melissa Bray denying that on the stand.
Was there ever a time where she came and met up with you in the middle of the night to get Oragel from you?
No.
No? Saying that never happened?
I'm saying it never happened.
No further questions.
Now, Flynn, do you think this gets rid of Leilani's alibi?
I think prosecutor Tim Dean believes that it gets rid of Leilani Simon's alibi. And even before this witness was brought up, she's known as Missy, she said today. Even before Tim Dean called her on the stand, she kind of said to the judge, they were kind of going over some scheduling things, and Dean said, look, this isn't going to take long because she's simply just going to come up here and say that everything that Leilani Simon has said about where she was meeting up to get the Oragel at the gas station in the hours before Quinton went missing is just a flat-out lie, and that's what exactly Missy did. It was interesting, though, that, you know, in Simon's story, she referred to this person, Missy, as Misty, and Missy gets up there and says, well, no, I'm actually Missy. I don't go by Misty. No one's ever called me that. So, I mean, it really, again, goes to that credibility thing of, well, I mean, what do jurors believe? The defense came in and they said, well, this was something that happened supposedly in the middle of the night 2 years ago. Is it possible that you just forgot about this? I mean, do you really remember everything that's happened to you over the past 2 years? And Missy saying something to the effect of, well, this is something that I would have particularly remembered. And just to kind of give some background, too, I mean, this was a former co-worker of Simon's at Bojangles. She said she only knows Simon for about 3 or 4 months, and this was someone Simon relied heavily on in her story to investigators, one of her first stories to investigators that she gave in the hours that she reported Quinton missing.
Now, the defense started the day today by zeroing in on Danny Youngkin. Now, you'll remember that is Leilani's boyfriend at the time Quinton went missing. The defense trying to zero in and paint a picture on his drug use there. Take a listen to that.
Just leave.
Just leave my daughter?
Mm-hmm.
No. No, sir.
All right. So you understand it's an option, though?
Not in my eyes.
So, but you would rather stay, drink, do drugs, and sleep?
I'd rather be there for my daughter.
Well, I understand. Let me ask you this. When you're drinking, doing drugs, and sleeping, how are you there for your daughter?
Not as well as I should have been.
Now, there were several moments today where it seemed as if the defense was trying to place a level of blame on Danny throughout testimony today. What effect do you guys think that has on the case, and do you think the jury will buy into that?
I mean, it's criminal defense 101. You have to plant those seeds. If you're going to sit there and say, no, this person is not guilty of what they're accused of, you kind of have to plant some seeds that there's somebody else out there that is guilty of what that person is accused of. Quinton Simon didn't end up in a landfill by some chance. Somebody put him there. And so by kind of starting to cast some suspicion on Danny by picking apart his story on that night, he admitted that he had taken drugs. He admitted that he had been drinking alcohol. He also admitted that his memory was very spotty. And so that's questionable. If there is really no evidence of what happened between the hours of midnight to 9 a.m. that night, and there's no physical evidence of what may have happened to Quinton or how he may have died, it's natural to look at somebody that was in the house, particularly somebody that has admitted that their own memory is a little bit spotty. And one thing I noticed the defense did, they brought up what Danny told investigators. The defense said that he had told investigators originally that he had woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning and the kids were safe. They questioned him about that, and he said, if I said that at the time, it's only because Leilani told me to. And then they asked him if he was saying what somebody was telling him to today, and he said, no, these are my own words today.
Yeah, and the state has to prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt, and the defense is trying to sow that reasonable doubt for jurors, right? And during jury selection, some of the jurors, or a lot of the jurors who were excused, said, well, if it's not Simon, then who? And I think the defense is trying to give them their who, you know, and so
Absolutely.
that reasonable doubt. Extensive conversation about Youngkin's, you know, to his own account, drug use that night, and they were, again, attacking his memory there, and, again, trying to go back to credibility, attacking that credibility of the witness today.
All right, Snyder, Shea Schrader, thank you again for your time. Court resumes tomorrow at 9 a.m., but stick with us here on the special edition of The News at 7.
Our Haley Boland out in the field again tonight as our live coverage continues. Good evening, Haley.
Yes, good evening, Dawn. I'm joined by Shea Schrader again to break down the key moments of testimony today on day 5 of testimony in the murder trial of Leilani Simon. Now, today, we heard from someone really close to the Simon family. That's Michelle McCarta, the family's babysitter. She took the stand today and spoke about what she says is mistreatment against Quinton. Take a listen.
Honestly, Quinton loved us. He was close to us. And I just felt like he would be better off at our house. Several times we got Quinton and he would be in a long onesie and he would have poop from all over. I don't want to say a baby didn't smell good, but he smelled like rotten milk. He had rings around his neck. We'd immediately bathe him.
Meanwhile, the defense tried to paint McCarta as someone who already had very strong opinions about Leilani. Here's what the defense had to say.
You've already formed opinions about Miss Simon at this point in time, correct?
I have.
Okay. And is it possible that you're projecting those opinions onto what her behavior should be according to you?
Absolutely not.
So you
I
think
do not.
So you think objectively that everybody should act the way you think they should?
No, I don't think everybody should act, but a mother that has children, that you carry them in your stomach by your heart. Why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't she?
Now, Shea, Miss McCarta is perhaps one of the witnesses who's been closest to Quinton that we've heard from so far. What do you think the prosecution accomplished by bringing her to the stand today?
You know, so much of the testimony that we've seen so far has felt a little bit like it's far removed from Quinton himself. It's been so focused on Leilani Simon, where she was that night, when she was at her drug dealer, when she went to the dumpsters, her relationship with Daniel Youngkin, and there's been very little mention of her actual relationship with Quinton. And so by putting Miss McCarta on the stand, I feel that the prosecution was really able to demonstrate what people in Quinton Simon's orbit thought about the treatment that he was receiving. I did think it was interesting when the defense was coming back on her and saying that she already had preconceived notions of Leilani, and then maybe trying to insinuate a little bit that she wasn't a reliable witness because of those notions that she had. But what I gained from what she said back to the defense is there's differences in parenting styles, but that line is child abuse. And what she was describing, a lot of people, I believe, would interpret as child abuse, not bathing your child, not feeding your child until his older sibling had already eaten. And then we also heard yesterday from Miss McCarta's daughter, who described seeing Leilani both verbally and physically abuse Quinton. And so I think that seeing somebody that cared that deeply about him really is going to have an emotional impact on the jury and remind them that at the end of the day, this case is about a 20-month-old kid who loved cheese and just wanted to watch Blimpie.
Yeah. And now, after Michelle took the stand today, we spent a lot of time delving into surveillance video from Azalea Mobile Home Park. Now, you'll remember that is the area where prosecutors allege that Leilani dumped Quinton's body in the dumpsters of that mobile home park. And today, it was revealed that a camera directly across from those dumpsters was not working properly. Here's some information about that.
We looked at the camera. We took the SD card out. I can use the term corrupted. This camera is not made for outside, and we all live in Savannah. It's humid, it's hot. This is not a ruggedized camera, and we were not able to pull any images or video from this camera at all.
Now, Shay, a lot of the surveillance video that we did see today was kind of from a distance. You can really only see that Dodge Journey that prosecutors say Leilani was driving at the time, and we don't really get a direct visual on Leilani either in some of that video. So what kind of impact do you think that has here?
I definitely don't think it helps the prosecution. I think that their best hope is that the jury is going to look at this video that we see of the car that does resemble Leilani Simon's car, but admittedly, you can't see her driving that car. You can't see her getting in or out of the car, pulling up to the dumpsters. You certainly can't tell whether she put something in the dumpsters. And so the prosecution's best hope is that they're going to take that information in that video they've seen, pair it with what they know about her cell phone data, and pair it with the fact that she admitted to being in the area, first saying that she was at the Chevron station, but then changing her story to say, yes, she was at the dumpsters, but it was to throw away stinky shrimp pasta. It's definitely detrimental to their case that they did not have that video pointed directly at the dumpster. I remember even before the indictment came down, the rumor in the community being that the FBI or some sort of law enforcement agency had come and seized that camera, and I remember thinking, if they have her on video putting something in the dumpster, who knows what they'll be able to make out, and that really could be it. And then to see that they weren't able to get that video, definitely disappointing from the stance of the prosecution.
Now, Shay, you mentioned this briefly in your statement there that while they don't have her directly on camera, her phone records do place her in the Azalea Mobile Home Park around the time when prosecutors allege she was dumping Quinton's body. Take a listen.
At approximately 1:14 a.m. on October 5th, the phone is observed driving down Buckhalter Road and then is observed in Azalea Mobile Home Park and then is shown back at the house. And that trip was approximately 15-20 minutes or so, I believe.
Were you able to observe any period of time during that trip where the phone was more or less stationary at Azalea?
Yes.
Now, again, no direct visual on Leilani, but do you think that between the phone records and the car on camera, do you think that's enough to convince a jury that she was out there?
I think it's going to be really hard to tell. Some people are more visual than others. I think it would certainly help if they had that video of her, allegedly putting something in that trash can. I do think that the jury is tasked with looking at the whole case and not just one bit of evidence, and you can classify the surveillance videos as one bit of evidence. And so again, if you pair that up with the phone records, her own statements that she made to police admitting that she was in the area and then changing her story, I believe that that might be enough altogether to convince the jury that she was indeed there at the time. And then you also can't discredit the fact we saw testimony today from a detective from the Chatham County Police Department describing how they were able to track where they eventually found Quinton's remains. They figured out what garbage truck would have been on the garbage route taking trash from the dumpster at Azalea, and they were able to have a manager at the landfill point out to them the general vicinity that that truck would have dumped in, and those are eventually where they found Quinton's remains. They didn't get there on their own. So all of that together, if you're a jury looking at all that evidence, it might be enough, but then again, it might not be.
Yes, and we started today in court before the jury was even brought in. Prosecutor Tim Dean making some statements today, taking issue with some facial expressions that Leilani had made during testimony the day prior. He also said that she had been mouthing some words while witnesses were on the stand, and the defense really pushed back on that notion. Take a listen.
I don't know how much control this particular defendant has over her facial expressions and mannerisms and things like that, but it seems like keeping your mouth shut is something that she ought to be able to accomplish.
But she has the absolute right to communicate with me and Mr. Purse. And the fact that the camera picked it up, irrelevant. The fact he didn't like what she said, completely irrelevant. The fact he's trying to tell her she can't say it, that is relevant. She has the absolute right to talk to us, Judge. And again, I didn't put the camera there. I don't put the camera on her, and I don't control what goes out.
Now, Shay, what was reaction in the courtroom like today to when that happened, and what do you take away from what Judge Tammy Stokes had to say?
It was definitely a little tense. Obviously, Prosecutor Tim Dean very passionate about this and very vehemently asking the judge to make sure she doesn't do it again. And then her defense team coming into her defense as they do, saying that it must have been something that she talked to them. We can't play the clip because of the obscenities that she is mouthing, but we can confirm she did mouth obscenities during the testimony of McCarta's daughter, and she was not indeed talking to her lawyers when that happened. Now, Judge Stokes' reaction, I think, was to diffuse the situation a little bit because it was getting so tense, and as she said, she hadn't seen the video. She herself did not notice Simon mouthing anything during witness testimony yesterday, but she did warn her to please not do that. And, you know, from Simon's perspective and the defense's perspective, they said that they did ask her to go ahead and write things down on a pad and hand to them instead of saying things outright, even if she did have something to discuss with counsel. So just a little note there about courtroom decorum and how this could really play to the jury if they had seen something like that as well.
Yeah, and I will say it did seem like that seemed to diffuse the situation a little bit today after Judge Stokes did kind of take a stand and make some statements regarding that. So,
yes, absolutely.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Shay. Court is back in session at 10 a.m. on Monday.
I was very confident we were going to find Quinton in the landfill when I spoke to her, yes.
Did you tell her that?
Yes.
How did she react to that?
She said he wasn't in the bag.
Good evening, and thanks for joining us again on this special edition of The News at 7. I'm Haley Bowl, and I'm joined here by Shay Schrader. Today is day 6 of testimony in the murder trial of Leilani Simon. Now, you'll remember she's the Chatham County mother accused of murdering her 20-month-old son, Quinton, and putting him in a dumpster. Now, today, again, on day 6 of testimony here at the Chatham County Courthouse, we heard from a lot of investigators in this case, a lot of FBI agents there, too, including Special Agent Brad Snyder. Now, he really started to delve into an interview he conducted with Leilani Simon on October 12th, where he says Leilani really started to reverse course on some of the things that she had already told law enforcement previously in the investigation. Take a listen.
The first change was the admission of significant drug use on the night of the 4th and the morning of the 5th. The interaction with Miss Melissa Bray in the Orgel story, that was a significant change, where over the course of the interview, she disclosed, agreed that actually did not happen. And then we obtained significant information as it relates to her purpose in the trailer park that night and throwing away trash.
Now, Shay, several things here. This is really one of the first times that Leilani had admitted to drug use that night that Quinton went missing. She also admitted to not meeting Missy, who's heavily in her alibi of that night, as well as throwing away trash that night as well. So what do you think this interview really accomplishes for the prosecution?
I mean, I think it goes to show that she is changing her story as she sees fit. Maybe she's not even really sure what happened, and that seems to be a little bit of her implication in the interviews. At one point she says, I don't think I did something to him, but if I did do something to him, I don't remember doing something to him. The admittance of using drugs, I think that shows that she was not of right and sound mind. She had mentioned before in police interviews that when she was on cocaine, which she admitted to being on that night, she could become angry and impulsive. I think that connection is going to stick in the juror's mind. And then when her story about who she referred to as Misty, the lady's name is actually Missy, starts to fall apart, she had to come up with some reason that that she was in that area. And so when she mentioned that she went to throw something away, she demonstrated to the investigators how she actually threw something away. And she mentioned that before she threw away what she said was stinky shrimp pasta, she opened it up to smell it before throwing it away. And investigators pressed her, why are you opening up your trash before you're throwing it away? That's not necessarily a normal thing to be doing before you throw your trash away. And as they said, she really didn't have an answer for that. So it just, again, is poking more holes in her story and showing the jury 100 times over why she isn't credible in a lot of these interviews.
And Shay, you did touch on this. Leilani Simon had previously stated that if she had anything to do with Quinton's disappearance, that she would be the one turning herself in. Now, this was a statement that was echoed in an October 24th interview with us here at WTOC. Take a listen.
My kids woke up to me screaming, "Where's Quinton?" and running through the house. I ran and looked everywhere, inside, outside, just started screaming for help. I've been here every day since this. I am not running and I'm not hiding. And if something does come up that I am at fault, I will take myself to that police station. And I will walk with her. All we want is justice for Quinton Simon. That's it. We want justice for Quinton.
Whatever cost it is. We don't care the cost.
We want answers just like everybody else does. At the end of it all, we love you, baby Q. My little monkey, and we want him home.
Now, this interview was presented in court today during testimony. Shay, you're actually the one who conducted this interview back on October 24th, back in 2022. Now, like we said earlier, it does seem that she was echoing some of the same things to you that she had told law enforcement.
Yeah, taking a look at the timeline, she had first told law enforcement on October 5th the story about her going to the Chevron station to get Orajel, that explaining why she was in the area of the mobile home plaza. A week later, on October 12th, she tells law enforcement, well, I was actually there to throw away this pasta. I don't remember anything happening, but if something comes up that I'm responsible, I will take accountability to that. And that's a sentiment that she echoed to me and to the community in that interview. She was saying she didn't remember, she didn't know exactly what happened, but she would take responsibility if it came out that she had anything to do with that. And from the law enforcement perspective and from the side of the prosecution, in opening statements, they referred to this portion of the interview, and they referred to her statements to investigators where she said that if something comes up, I'll take responsibility. And they were asking the question, why would she say that? What could come up that would implicate you in all this? And so that is the question that prosecutors brought up to jurors in opening statements, and that correlates directly with what she was saying publicly and what she was saying to investigators behind the scenes for a good long while.
Yeah, and Shay, I think what gets interesting about the timeline here as well is that prosecution brought up today, shortly after that interview aired, or right around that time the interview was airing, Leilani Simon sent a text message to FBI Special Agent Savannah Solomon saying that she wasn't going to cover for her boyfriend Daniel Youngkin anymore. This was the first time that she had ever made a statement like that. That FBI agent read that text message in court today. Here's a look at that.
I'm not lying for Danny anymore. The reason why my story about Orajel and didn't make sense was because Danny told me to say that. He was the one who left, and my phone was in the car from my previous trip, and his was on the charger. I was already smoking a blunt on the porch, and when I got done, Danny was already laying in bed. All the lights were off, and I glanced at the kids as I was getting in the bed to go to sleep. That is why he took off. I'm innocent of this. He was the last one to see Quinton. He is that texted the babysitter, and he was that wasn't in bed when I woke for just a moment, and it was still dark, and he was the one who the only set of keys to my car the morning of my son's disappearance.
And yet again, this is another change of pace from what Leilani Simon had previously told investigators. Shay, what stands out to you about this text message?
It's obviously pointing the finger at Daniel Youngkin. There's no way around it. And I think what's interesting is this is just one of several points throughout the investigation that we see her trying to take the blame off of herself and maybe point the finger at somebody else. At a certain point during the investigation, she had told investigators that she had received messages from Quinton's father threatening to take him away, and that she was implying she was concerned that he had something to do with this. Investigators found out that his father hadn't had anything to do with him virtually for his entire life. And so that story was kind of thrown out the window. Now she's said publicly to the community that if she's responsible, she will take responsibility for it, but is now turning around and saying that her current boyfriend might be the one that was responsible for Quinton's disappearance. And so I think this just shows the desperation almost as her lies are being called out to her by investigators. Every single time a hole is poked in her story, she comes up with something else. And so this comes off a little bit as an 11th hour move. But from the defense's side, they have made it clear through their cross-examination that they have not ruled out Daniel Youngkin as a suspect. So it'll be interesting to see what they have to say about that.
Something else that was brought up in testimony today was things that Leilani had been saying about Quinton during the time that they were searching for him. An investigator on the stand today said that Leilani had started to say some things as if he had already passed before they actually informed the family of Quinton's death. Take a listen to this.
She showed me her Hawaiian symbol tattoo about the waves going up and down and said that she wanted to get a tattoo in honor of Quinton along with it.
And this was on October 5.
It was.
She was talking about getting a tattoo with it.
In honor of him, yes.
Okay. At this point in time, was she still kind of representing the story that Quinton had been abducted?
Yes.
Was anybody yet talking about Quinton being dead?
We suspected it within the investigative team, but it had not been discussed outside of the investigative team.
Now, Shay, what do you think anecdotes like this do for the jury?
This is just another example of something coming, from Leilani that doesn't quite add up. And that's what Agent Solomon said on the stand. She was referring to several interactions that she had with Leilani that didn't seem to add up. Her talking about getting a memorial tattoo for Quinton before it had even been a conversation that he was deceased. Why would she be talking about that when she should likely be focusing on looking for her son, hopefully alive? Another anecdote that Solomon gave is she delivered the news to the Simon family that they were going to be searching the waste management landfill for Quinton and that they were almost certain that they were going to find his remains there. And she said that Simon did not seem to be as hysterical as she would expect and that she was not in shock, which is what you would expect from a mother who just found out that their child somehow ended up in a landfill. And so I think all of these things, again, are just chipping away at her credibility. And it's going to make the jury wonder, why was she responding to these things in a way that investigators are saying over and over again is not the typical response of somebody that is truly innocent in this situation?
All right, Shay Schrader, thank you so much.
Thank you.
On day 6 of testimony here at the Chatham County Courthouse. Now stick with us. We'll have some legal analysis coming up from Savannah Criminal Defense Attorney Jonah Pine. We've got that coming up for you on the other side of this break. Stick with us.
Breaking.
Was it rewarding also? I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Very emotional testimony there in the Leilani Simon murder trial this evening. Good evening and thanks for joining us. I'm Dawn Baker. My co-anchor Haley Boland is out live in the field once again tonight for the special edition of B News at 7. Well, today, prosecutors called up more witnesses in the Leilani Simon murder trial. She's the mother, as you know, accused of killing Quinton, her 20-month-old son, and discarding his body in a dumpster 2 years ago in Chatham County. We have a lot to get to. Let's go straight to our Haley Boland. Haley, who did they call to the stand today on day 7 of testimony?
Yes, good evening, Dawn. I'm once again joined by Shay Schrader and Flynn Snyder to break down what happened in court today. Now, the state called several people directly involved with the landfill search for Quinton Simon's remains to the stand today. Now, before that, though, the prosecution presented evidence of a relationship between Leilani Simon and her alleged drug dealer. That's Craig Weston. Detective Marion Lemons read some text messages between the two today. Take a listen.
Let me just ask you, can you kind of summarize what these communications show as far as what was going on with the two of them, between the two of them during, say, late September, early October?
So pretty much from when Leilani saved Craig into her phone, it appears that they began a sexual relationship and were scheduling meetups to meet and have sexual intercourse.
Now, Craig Weston also took the stand today, but cameras were not allowed for that portion. However, you guys were both in the courtroom for that testimony. What was covered and what did the prosecution prove with this evidence today?
Well, Haley, Judge Tammy Stokes ordered cameras to be cut during Craig Weston's testimony today, siding with the state, who argued that audio and video should not be recorded during his testimony because of the nature of what was expected to be said. And they were also worried that the presence of cameras would impact what Weston had to say. The defense, on the other hand, pushed back and said, well, look, most every other witness who has come up on the stand has had to be recorded and audio recorded, so why should Weston get special exemptions, essentially, from doing the same? It's appeared to me that prosecutors called Weston to the stand and presented the evidence of this relationship between Simon and her alleged drug dealer to point to a fraught relationship between Simon and her then boyfriend. That was one of the personal stressors that prosecutors believe contributed to Simon ultimately killing her own toddler. Shay, just as to how much the jurors picked up from that, it remains to be seen.
Yeah, it was really interesting. Part of the reason the prosecution didn't want cameras in the room is they said that the nature of what they were going to be asking Weston was very salacious. Going back to those sexual text messages between Weston and Simon that had already been admitted into evidence. And it was interesting because they called Detective Marion Lemons to the stand before they called Weston to the stand and had her read out those text messages to the jury. When they actually called Weston in, his testimony didn't last very long at all. I would say no more than 5 minutes. And what they were really zeroing in on was his location the night that Quinton Simon was reported missing. We know that Leilani was in the area of Highway 204 and Arkwright Lane to get drugs, but Weston testified that he was not in that area, so it remains to be seen how that specifically is going to play into the rest of the case.
Now, aside from that, a lot of the day, again, did focus on that search for those remains in the landfill off Little Neck Road here in Chatham County. Now, a manager with Waste Management, that's who operates that landfill, took the stand today. He spoke about how his business aided in that search. Take a listen.
Did you all have to do this, provide personnel and equipment?
No.
Why did you do it?
Just because of the significance of what happened.
All told, do you have any idea how much money this costs Waste Management?
Once we shift operation, it costs us between $70,000 or $80,000 to move the operation.
Now, Shay, this search was a massive undertaking. It lasted 4 weeks, I believe over a month in 2022. Now, how was that presented to the jury today, and what do you think they gained from that?
I think having witnesses on the stand testifying just the extent of the landfill search is really emotional for the jury, because when you say landfill search, people don't really know what goes into that. But you have somebody from the company, a private entity, saying that they spent around $70,000 or $80,000 in this process, giving their equipment, giving their employees. We heard later in the day from people that volunteered to participate in this landfill search, and I think that the prosecution is looking to highlight that, look, this little boy's life mattered that much. People were willing to spend that much money. They were willing to sift through garbage that smelled bad for weeks on end in a really physically and mentally draining task, all to make sure that this little boy had justice. They have, for their entire case, done a pretty excellent job of picking away at Leilani Simon's credibility and highlighting parts of her motherhood that other people find questionable. And so the juxtaposition of how she treated her own son versus the lengths that other people in the community were willing to go to, that they really didn't have to do to find his body and recover his remains, just shows that people did value this little boy's life. And I think that's the message they want to give to the jury, is that his life had value.
Now, something else that was interesting today is that the defense used this as an opportunity to point out that this is really only one of 2 major landfills in the county. So this landfill does accept both commercial and residential waste, and trying to imply that there are multiple origins of where Quinton's remains could have come from to have ended up in that landfill. Take a listen.
Now, let's talk about, I guess it's the, what was it you called the area you're dumping in, or dumping waste in?
It's a landfill cell.
A landfill cell. Okay. How many landfill cells do you have operating at one time in the dump?
Just one.
Okay. So with regard to that landfill cell that's operating, any and all trucks that come in there dump in that landfill cell, correct?
That's correct.
Now, again, the defense trying to create some doubt as far as where Quinton's remains could have come from. Flynn, what kind of effect do you think that has on what the jury's thinking at this moment?
Well, the landfill manager testified that hundreds of trucks on that particular day dumped their trash in that same spot. Now, it's a 10 to 13 acre spot. It's no small spot, but they did dump it in the same spot. And so it definitely does imply that the defense was trying to instill some doubt here among the jury, essentially saying that, look, you can't exactly trace Quinton Simon's remains back to this specific truck that picked up from the Azalea Home Mobile Plaza dumpsters, which is where prosecutors say Simon dumped her toddler's body. It's also interesting here, Haley, that there is a juror on this panel who says he works for Waste Management and knows of the landfill manager who testified today. Really interesting that he was selected for this panel. And we know that because he disclosed this information during jury selection. It just was striking to me following that jury selection process that somebody who works at the landfill where this search happened ended up on this panel. And it could, depending on what side you look at it from, aid in the jury of understanding this very technical process that is the landfill and waste management system. I mean, they had to play a 2-minute YouTube explainer video today about just exactly how landfills work to kind of give the jury just a baseline understanding of how the operations are concerned. So it could aid in helping the jurors kind of understand the complexities of the landfill process. As to what side that ultimately benefits at the end of the day, though, that's remained to be seen.
And now there was some emotional testimony as a result of discussing a landfill search as well. A Chatham County police officer took the stand today. She was one of the first people to find any remains in that search, and she did start to get emotional during her testimony. Take a listen.
In the morning, was it a normal day?
Yes, sir.
What do you remember about the point where it became not a normal day?
I was just breaking through the garbage, and then I had observed a white small object that could fit in the palm of my hand. It looked like bone to me.
Now, the day Quinton's remains were found, November 18th, that day was basically relived in court today. Again, that officer at one point even crying on the stand when asked how that felt to find those remains. My question to both of you is, what's the effect of that testimony today, as well as, like how emotional was that, and what was the courtroom reaction as well?
Officer Zerke, who's the officer that we just saw on the stand that testified, she found one of the first pieces of Quinton's remains. She was also one of the first officers on scene the morning that Quinton was reported missing, and she had said that it was important for her to see it through. To see somebody that was willing to give up so much of her time, again, in such a grueling environment, in a landfill, doing something very physically demanding day by day, you pair that with the fact that she said she didn't have to be there. She volunteered to do it because she wanted to see it through, and at any point she could have stopped and nobody would have made her stay there. Again, to see somebody this invested in the little boy's life that they didn't even know, I think goes to show the jury how great a value his life really did have. And I also think it's interesting when the Chatham County Police Department and the FBI announced that they were doing this search, they said that it possibly would have a very low success rate. And so the fact that people were able to keep, plunging on and get this done shows the effort that was put behind this.
Yeah, and the FBI agent who was kind of lead on the landfill search testified today that the remains were found on essentially the last day before volunteers and people who were searching were going to break for Thanksgiving. And this piece of testimony today really played on something that we have seen the prosecution rely on heavily, which is emotion. It played to the emotional factor, right? The officer crying and the prosecution's line of defense kind of ended once she started to shed some tears. It does leave the door open for the defense to come through in closing statements, and in their case, I guess, when they kind of argue their case, to say, well, look, I mean, yes, this is sad and this is tough. I mean, I don't think anyone would want to see this happen to a toddler, but does this point to Leilani Simon doing this, right? And that's where I think, you know, the defense can come in and say what they've been saying this whole time is this case, the prosecution's case, is based on nothing but conclusions and emotions. But again, it could leave the door open for them to come in and say, well, does it actually point to Leilani Simon doing it?
All right, Flynn Snyder, Shay Schrader, thank you guys so much for your reporting again on day 7 of testimony here in the Leilani Simon trial. Now stick with us here on The News at 7. I'll be joined once again by criminal defense attorney Jonah Pine to break down some more of what we heard today. Stick with us.
Your first
Once again, we have live team coverage continuing outside of the courtroom. Our Haley Boland joining us live from the field. Haley, walk us through what happened in court today.
Yeah, good evening, Dawn. Some big moments in court today as both the prosecution and defense rested their cases. Now, I'm joined by Flynn Snyder and Shay Schrader to break down what happened here on day 8 of testimony. Now, today focused on a 3-hour-long interview between Leilani and investigators that happened on November 21st, the day Leilani was arrested. Now, this interview is significant because it's the first time that she doesn't directly deny some of the things that FBI agents have alleged may have happened that night that Quinton went missing. Detective Marion Lemons taking the stand today to explain that interview. Take a listen.
Was she asked at some point by you, I think we can all agree that something did happen.
Yes.
And did she nod her head yes in response to that?
Yes, she did.
Was she asked, do you think you may have killed him or something to that effect?
Yes.
And is it the case that she was just not able to give an answer to that or just didn't really say anything?
That's correct.
Now, this was a big moment in court today, so this question is for both of you. What was reaction like from jurors, and how does this really help drive home the prosecution's main points here?
I think it took the air out of the room a little bit because so far in this case, we've seen videos of Leilani being interviewed by investigators, very vehemently denying that she had anything to do with what happened to Quinton, telling them time and time again that she went to the area of the Azalea Mobile Home Plaza, and when she came home, she saw Quinton safe in his bed. She reneged on that story in this interview. She had previously told investigators that when she was at the garbage dumpster, she was throwing away 1 bag of spoiled shrimp pasta. She went back on that and said she was throwing away 2 bags. And then in this same interview, when they pressed her on what was in the bag or if she had anything to do with what happened to Quinton, she didn't deny it, which was completely a reverse course from what we had seen from her. And so I think the jurors are going to be questioning again, why is her story changing again if she has nothing to hide?
And this was some of the most compelling evidence that I think the jurors saw throughout this trial, and it really tied up a lot of the things that prosecutors were alleging throughout this proceeding, mainly one of which being the devolving lies that Simon told prosecutors and investigators in the weeks following Quinton's disappearance. You know, in her early interviews, whenever she was pressed on her timeline and her statements and her changing stories, Detective Lemon said she went into these hysterical crying rants, and now we see Simon maybe backed into a corner a little bit here and essentially giving non-answers when the FBI agent Solomon there would kind of lob these statements and accusations at Simon, and she would just kind of give these non-answers. This was also a significant moment in the trial because this was one of the first times that Simon's defense team got to cross-examine Detective Lemons. I mean, this is the prosecutor's star witness, and they kind of pressed her saying, well, who are you to say how a mother should act in the hours after her child goes missing, and what kind of metric do you use to determine exactly how a mother should act? So it was quite a striking moment, not only from the video evidence standpoint, but also how the defense team chose to attack it afterwards.
You can really see why they saved it for last.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and something else that stands out about this interview as well is that you have Leilani admitting to a gap of time in her memory due to her drug use. Detective Lemons on the stand explaining that portion of the interview as well. Take a listen.
What did she arrive at ultimately for the period of time for which she was claiming a total lack of memory?
She said the last thing that she remembered was looking at Quinton and then driving back from Azalea.
looking at Quinton after the art rack trip.
Yes, and then blacking out, and then coming back to it as she's coming back from Azalea.
Now we're talking about a 2-hour gap in time in Leilani's memory that she's admitting to on that night that prosecutors allege Quinton went missing and was murdered. So Shay, what do you think the effect is of pointing that out in front of the jury today?
I think their question is going to be, is this an admission of a lapse in memory, or is this just yet another lie by Simon? She had already confirmed to investigators that she was in the area of Azalea Mobile Home Plaza that morning, and then she goes back and says she doesn't have any memory of that happening. That's very hard to believe, that you put yourself essentially at potentially the scene of a crime and then renege on that and expect really that investigators will believe that. So I think that the jury is going to have the question of, again, is this just another one of her stories? And at one point in the interview, Leilani mentioned to the investigators that all of her previous stories, that she was getting Orajel from a friend, that she was throwing away shrimp pastas, those were just theories. Yeah. And Detective Lemons was questioned, did these seem theoretical or like theories to you at the time? And she said no, these seemed like very detailed stories that could have possibly been recalled from memory.
Now, after the state rested their case this afternoon, the defense asked Judge Tammy Stokes to decide if the state had enough evidence to bring about 4 charges in front of the jury. Now, those are 3 murder charges as well as the charge for concealing the death of another. Now, Judge Tammy Stokes eventually siding with the state. Take a listen to that exchange.
At this point, the state's evidence is ground in speculation and grave suspicion, but not on facts and not on evidence.
A circumstantial case does have, the evidence does have to exclude all reasonable theories other than guilt, and we've done that.
I am going to find that based on the argument made by the state, the court finds that there is sufficient evidence that has been presented for the jury for the charges in the indictment to be considered.
Now, this does allow all the charges to be considered by the jury when it gets sent to them for deliberation. Some other things of note today: Leilani Simon officially will not be testifying in her own case. And also, the defense rested shortly after this decision from Judge Stokes. So, Flynn, my question to you is, what do you think's on the minds of jurors right now after all of these decisions were made today?
Yeah, well, I think that what was mentioned, and of course, jurors were not in the courtroom when this argument between whether those 4 charges in the indictment would be presented to jurors was made. But during those arguments, you heard Leilani Simon's defense team, Robert Purse, repeat a line that he's repeated during his opening statements and is most likely going to say during his closing statements, that, look, these murder charges and the concealing of a death charge should not be presented to jurors because prosecutors just have not laid out sufficient evidence to prove that. They say that a lot of the things that prosecutors have introduced here in trial have raised hypotheses, but nothing points directly to Leilani Simon's guilt of murder and concealing the death of Quinton Simon. The prosecution essentially pushed back and said, look, we believe that we've excluded all other possibilities other than, intentional act of harm towards Quinton, and that these charges laid out in the indictment should be presented to jurors. So everything that was laid out in the indictment will be deliberated by the jury, maybe potentially starting tomorrow. And as you said, Haley, it was notable too that Simon herself took the stand telling Judge Stokes that she would not testify in her own defense. So those were 2 aspects of the case that the defense kind of put up, and leads into kind of what we expect them to say in closing arguments, which is like, look, a lot of this is circumstantial, a lot of this is conclusions and opinions, but nothing is hard and concrete as far as pointing the finger directly at Leilani Simon here as far as the murder and concealing of the death of Quinton Simon is concerned.
Now, earlier this morning, too, we heard from an FBI forensic examiner who was actually able to run some tests on a bit of brain tissue that was found with Quinton Simon's remains. Ultimately, that medical examiner finding that there was no presence of drugs in that brain tissue. Take a listen to that testimony.
After all that, what was the result or conclusion you reached as to whether this brain tissue contained any cocaine or cocaine metabolites?
I did not detect any.
Okay, so negative?
Not detected.
Now, the prosecution using this as an opportunity to point out that they're ruling out yet another potential cause of death for Quinton Simon. However, the defense using it to really focus on the fact that there, again, isn't a cause of death in this case for Quinton Simon. So my question for both of you is, how do you think this is going to come into play, this cause of death, as we head into closing statements tomorrow? And is there anything else that you guys think will be brought up during closing arguments?
I'm sure it didn't take the jurors by shock. In his opening statements, Tim Dean said we are not going to be able to establish a cause of death because Quinton's remains were in such poor condition. And I thought it was interesting when Peirce was moving to essentially have Simon acquitted on those first 4 charges on the indictment. He specifically mentioned that the prosecution failed to allege a manner of death and that therefore that's not enough to convict her on murder. But Dean comes back and he says, we knew this. You're misinterpreting what this means to the case. He says because his remains were in such poor condition, the burden is really not on us to show a manner of death, and that's why we've had to rely so heavily on circumstantial evidence. And the judge ended up agreeing, which is why she decided to send those charges back over to the jury. That doesn't answer the question, though, of whether that is going to be enough for the jury to convict her on murder charges. But I do think it says at least something that the judge sent that decision over to them instead of unilaterally making it herself.
During the arguments of that direct verdict, or for that motion of direct verdict of appeal of acquittal today, you heard Leilani Simon's defense attorney, Robert Peirce, kind of refer back to the testimony from the medical examiner that we heard that said, there was no opinion on a manner or time of death for Quinton Simon. And in his arguments, prosecutor Tim Dean kind of pushed back and said, look, there are so many ways to die. We've excluded all of them except an intentional act of violence. So it kind of made sense why they brought in all these experts to kind of rule out all the other causes of death, to kind of close the door on any sort of doubt a juror might have as far as something else that might have happened to Quinton Simon. Just closing thoughts, though, I will say that 3-hour-long FBI video today where Simon necessarily doesn't refute a lot of the accusations investigators made was striking, and I think will loom large over deliberations when they do begin.
All right, Flynn Snyder, Shay Schrader, thank you so much for your time on day 8 of testimony here in the murder trial of Leilani Simon.
Quinton was her disposable child.
She should have opened the damn door before she called her.
You cannot speculate someone into a guilty verdict, ladies and gentlemen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us for this special edition of The News at 7. I'm Dawn Baker. As you just heard, the prosecution and the defense laying out their case one last time to the jury today during closing arguments. Now it's in those jurors' hands to determine the fate of Leilani Simon. She's the Chatham County mother accused of killing her toddler Quinton and throwing him in a dumpster. Tonight, our Haley Boland is live again in the field, breaking down what happened in the courtroom. Haley, good evening.
Yeah, good evening, Dawn. Still no verdict in the murder trial of Leilani Simon. Jurors were sent into deliberations just after 3:15 today and asked to go home for the day around 5. They'll take it back up again tomorrow. Now I'm joined once again by Flynn Snyder and Shay Schrader to break down everything that we've learned today on this day of closing arguments. Some emotional statements from both sides today. Take a listen.
Leilani Simon is not a mother. She is a monster. And I do not use that word lightly. But what this woman did in this case is horrific. And she is absolutely a monster. We cannot undo the horror of what she did that night.
And my biggest fear is this case deals with so much emotion. The law says that the case must not be side-decided, for or against anyone, because you feel sorry for anyone or you're angry at anyone.
Some dramatic statements to send jurors into deliberations today during closing arguments. Now, how much do you guys think that emotion will come into play as these jurors start to decide amongst one another?
Haley, I think it's really hard to tell what the jury is thinking because they have to keep such a neutral expression throughout the trial. We definitely saw them taking copious notes, but it's hard to really tell what's going to affect who in what way when they go into that deliberation room. Now, that being said, as Mr. Hilliard, Leilani Simon's defense attorney, said to the jury, this is a group of people that were selected because they said that they had the ability to put their emotions aside and look at only the facts and the evidence that was presented to them. I think the bigger question is how much of Leilani Simon's emotion, both throughout the investigation and videos that they saw of her, and her emotion sitting throughout the trial and seeing the evidence presented, is going to affect them. As prosecutor Tim Dean pointed out, her emotions are very much fair game, and so they were exposed to a roller coaster of emotions from her from beginning to end, when Quinton was first reported missing, to these hysterical rants that she went through, and then finally to what seemed like resignation in the last interview that she did before she was arrested. But again, the question of whether jurors are going to be able to put it aside, we're only going to be able to tell that after the fact.
Yeah, the closing arguments on both sides today were quite remarkable. You had Tim Dean, the prosecutor on this case, kind of methodically go through a lot of the evidence, and then Martin Hilliard, Simon's defense attorney, come up and say, well, this is a lot of it's based on emotions and conclusions. And like you heard him say there in the intro, is you can't speculate your way into believing someone is guilty. And then you had Jenny Parker come on, who's kind of been a little bit more quieter. She's on the prosecution team, but hasn't really spoken too much during the trial. And she said, well, you know, this trial is about emotion. Like you said, it's about Simon's emotion and her demeanor and how she was acting in the hours and days after her son Quinton was reported missing. So it's quite remarkable. And I also don't want it to be lost on us that this case is now in the hands of a jury, right? More than 2 years after prosecutors say Simon was killed, in a case that gripped our community, sent shockwaves nationwide, really, based off of the really shocking details that came out in the course of the investigation.
And both sides today, once again, using closing arguments as a chance to delve into Leilani's relationships. The prosecution even stating today that this may have been a motive to kill Quinton Simon, that Leilani was trying to gain back the attention of her boyfriend at the time, Daniel Youngkin. Take a listen to that argument.
This defendant craves attention. She needs attention, specifically male attention. She needs it like you need oxygen. That is what is going on with her.
The rest of that year.
Meanwhile, the defense arguing that if Leilani was in fact having an affair with her alleged drug dealer, Craig Weston, that need would have been satisfied and has nothing to do with Quinton's death. Take a listen to that.
Unless you believe the fevered dream they've come up with, that in some way, shape, or form, this has something to do with her attention seeking. And I don't get that, because if someone is craving that much attention, and they find that attention, and they have someone that gives them that attention, wouldn't that take away the struggle? Wouldn't that take away the strain?
Now, the prosecution did say today that Leilani becoming the mother of a missing child might have given her the attention she so longed for. So, Flynn, what do you think of that argument today?
Yeah, well, Jenny Parker made that argument to kind of wrap up the prosecution's case to jurors. And it's something that she said also during the evidentiary motion hearing that was on the second day of this trial, where she basically stood up and said, look, Judge Stokes, we are trying to prove that Leilani Simon was such a, and I believe the quote was, a desperately unhappy woman, that she killed her son Quinton so that she would be loved. And we heard Jenny Parker in her closing argument say, look, once Danny Youngkin got the call that Simon's son Quinton was missing, he ran out of work. He was right there by her side, and that's exactly what she wanted. You know, they said that, you know, the personal stressors, the fraught relationship with Danny, and the drug use, and those were contributing factors to Simon ultimately killing her son Quinton. Now, the defense is doing their job in sowing some reasonable doubt and saying, well, listen, if Simon so desperately craved attention, she was getting it from her alleged drug dealer at the time. And it was quite evident from the text that the prosecutor said. So you heard Martin Hilliard there say, well, you know, why would she need to kill her kid for attention if she was getting that attention from another person? So again, trying to sow that reasonable doubt there in the jury. How much that kind of resonates with them is remained to be seen. I think that line of she needs attention like you need oxygen, it stuck with me. I don't know how much it'll stick with the jury.
Yeah, absolutely. And the prosecution again referenced the interview between law enforcement and Leilani Simon that happened on November 21st. Now, you'll remember this is the day Leilani was arrested, and she did admit to about a 2-hour gap in her memory the night that Quinton went missing. And prosecutor Tim Dean today calling that almost a confession. Take a listen.
This is the closest you're going to get to a confession from this woman. All right? You can read this as a confession to concealing Quinton's death by throwing him in the dumpster.
Now, this interview is definitely some of the prosecution's strongest evidence throughout this trial. Shay, what do you think that jurors will be considering and taking away from this interview as they deliberate?
I think it really makes sense on the state side why they saved that as the last piece of evidence, really, that they presented to the jury. And it made sense chronologically for the timeline because it was the last interview that she did before she was arrested. But it really does read as she has resigned herself. She doesn't have any more stories to tell or theories, as she called them herself. She's not denying that she did something to her son. And I believe as a juror, you might be looking at that and thinking, why is she not protesting this in the way that she's previously protested this? If you really don't have anything to hide, why are you not denying the horrible things that you're being accused of right now? And I think that Dean bringing that back up as an almost admission of guilt and characterizing it that way, a lot of jurors are likely bound to take it that way. There are only so many ways that you can really read that. But as the defense said, it was not technically an admission of guilt, but it was not an admission or an assertion of innocence either.
Gotcha. Now, the defense used some time today discussing Leilani's boyfriend, Danny Youngkin, stating that he's possibly not completely innocent in all of this. Meanwhile, the prosecution alleging that Danny is not capable of this crime. Here's a listen to that back and forth.
We would submit to you that he came in here and was just an open book, a guy doing his level best to tell you the truth. And there's some things about his manner of testifying that give that impression. One is he's not hiding anything, he's not covering anything up.
Quite frankly, the state has to believe Mr. Youngkin's testimony. Their whole theory of the case depends on it. Because of Mr. Youngkin's statement that he saw Quinton Simon at 3 a.m., saw Quinton Simon at 5:30 a.m., and then texted the babysitter and Quinton was fine, their entire theory of the case falls apart.
Now, these questions are for both of you. What do you all think of the defense's attempt to cast reasonable doubt on this final day before deliberations? And, what do you think jurors will be spending the most time on as they talk to each other?
The defense has been planting this seed the entire time. Insinuations that they've made upon cross-examination, really zeroing in on Daniel Youngkin's original statement to the police that he had gotten up and seen the kids at 3 a.m. Now, he testified on the stand that he doesn't remember saying that, but he believes if he did, he was only doing it because Leilani told him to at the time, so that'll likely stick in the juror's mind as well. But as far as what they're going to be focusing on in the deliberation room, they have asked the judge for copies of the indictment, and I think that's going to be really important because it shows how closely they are considering this, and they want to know exactly what the allegations are on paper. They want to have it on print, and they want to compare the evidence, both circumstantial and direct evidence that they've seen, and apply it to that. But you can't forget that they are looking at the whole case and not just a couple of pieces of evidence, and they've been directed that closing arguments are not evidence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the defense saved some of their harshest words during their closing arguments for Daniel Youngkin. They called him a sock puppet witness, just perpetuating the state's case, and saying that the investigation really overlooked a lot of things when it came to Daniel Youngkin. They're trying to open that door that there might have been another person responsible for Quinton Simon's death. And in a trial where prosecutors have spent so much time trying to close every other possibility except the door that has Leilani Simon's guilt all over it, the defense was trying to open another door and say, well, Daniel Youngkin was also there. He was also invested in the kids' lives. He was there, and I believe he called them mean kids at one point. So he was definitely showed some anger towards the living situation at the time. But it definitely explains some of the challenges that prosecutors had as far as making up the discrepancies in Daniel Youngkin's initial testimony, where he was like, well, I woke up, I saw Quinton, but then he was like, no, I didn't. So I think prosecutors, too, in their closing arguments also took the time to explain that discrepancy so that there were no questions left in the jurors' minds.
And Shay, you mentioned, too, the jury has requested copies of the indictment, so we do want to remind our viewers at home what exactly is in that indictment. So Leilani Simon is charged with malice murder, 2 counts of felony murder, concealing the death of another, making a false report of a crime, as well as 14 counts of making a false statement. Now, these are all of the charges that the jury will be considering as they continue to deliberate. They pick back up tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. And stick with us here on this special report of the news at 7. We'll be right back.
A 2-year investigation coming to a close.
You can give him the justice he deserves, and you can give her the justice she deserves.
When there's a tie in the evidence like that, the tie goes to the defendant every single time.
From the moment Quinton Simon disappeared from his Chatham County home,
Chatham 911, what's your emergency? Yeah, I need to come back right back on Culture Road. We believe it's coming from kidnapping.
to the long weeks of police work and searching for the toddler's remains.
She doesn't deserve a Thanksgiving, quite frankly, if I can go off script a little bit. Quinton deserves that.
Being one of the first on scene, I wanted to see it through.
After almost 2 weeks of testimony, a jury decides the fate of the mother accused of killing her 20-month-old son. The final verdict.
We find the defendant guilty.
The News at 7 starts right now.
Good evening and thanks for joining us for this last part of our special edition of The News at 7. I'm Dawn Baker. Tonight, the Chatham County mother will remain behind bars, this time as a convicted killer. A jury found Leilani Marie Simon guilty on all 19 charges today for murdering her son Quinton. All these counts include malice and felony murder, as well as concealing the death of another, false report of a crime, and making false statements. Once again, we have a lot to get to straight away, detailing the last day and the final moments in the courtroom. WTOC's Haley Boland joins us now live from outside of the Chatham County Courthouse. Haley, good evening.
Yeah, good evening, Dawn. Leilani Simon now officially a convicted murderer. I'm joined here by Flynn Snyder and Shay Schrader to break down what we've learned on verdict day here today. Judge Tammy Stokes reading that verdict today just before 3 p.m. Take a listen.
As to the verdict, it reads as follows. We, the jury, find as follows: malice murder. We find the defendant guilty. Count 2, felony murder. We find the defendant guilty. Count 3, felony murder. We find the defendant guilty. Count 4, concealing the death of another. We find the defendant guilty.
District Attorney Shalina Cook-Jones released a statement following today's verdict, reading in part, quote, "No matter what her sentence will be, this mother will have to live with her actions every single day of her life, and that is a prison of its own." Now, Flynn and Shay, you guys were both in the courtroom when that verdict was read today. I do want to know, what was reaction like inside the courtroom, and what are some of your main takeaways from today?
The tension was extremely palpable, not just from the prosecution and the defense, but also the people that were in the courtroom, some of the witnesses in the case that had testified against Simon, some of the investigators that had put in hours and hours their evidence that ultimately led to this conviction. But what stood out to me the most is that Simon herself showed very little emotion throughout the trial, even confronted with photos of her son's remains that were recovered from that Chatham County landfill, only occasionally crying. But after that verdict was read, she was outwardly sobbing, the most emotion that we had seen from her in 2 weeks of testimony.
Yeah, the jurors deliberated for about 6.5 hours today. They got started about 9:28, and then around 2:30 we heard a knock on the jury door, and they handed a yellow slip to the bailiff saying they had a statement, and we were all kind of wondering, well, do they have a verdict? Like, what are they actually trying to say here? And we were kind of on pins and needles for about 10 minutes until Judge Stokes took the bench once again, and she said, we have a verdict. And then about 2 minutes later, that verdict was read guilty on all 19 counts.
Now, we do want to break down these 19 charges as well. Sentencing in this case is scheduled for a future date, but we do know 3 of these 19 charges, that's malice murder and 2 counts of felony murder, all carry a potential sentence of life in prison. Now, the charge of concealing the death of another carries a prison sentence of up to 10 years. Now, the jury reached this verdict today without an official cause of death for Quinton Simon. Prosecutor Jenny Parker acknowledged that that was a major obstacle for the prosecution. Take a listen.
Our biggest challenge was not having an autopsy because of the circumstances in which this child died. We presented additional medical evidence in place of that. Also had a forensic anthropologist from the FBI who came and spoke. And so we used that evidence in place of where we normally would use autopsy evidence in a murder trial.
Now, clearly, jurors found that they had enough evidence to convict on these charges. Shay, what do you think was maybe a tipping point for them?
I think that they had to look at the entire case. I don't know that there is one piece of evidence that sent them one way or another. Of course, we don't know because we weren't in the room. They were left with a very powerful piece of evidence as the last piece of testimony, and that was Simon being pressed about whether she had killed Quinton on the day she was arrested and her failing to say that she hadn't. And so that was probably very compelling. But at the end of the day, because there was no cause or manner of death, they were tasked with looking at the entire case. And even though the prosecution, again, didn't have that manner of death, what they did have was cell phone data showing Simon at the dumpsters. They had her statements admitting to be at the dumpsters. They had records from Waste Management showing exactly where that dumpster would have dumped its load. And they had remains of Quinton's that were recovered in that location. And so if I'm the juror, I'm going to be using deductive reasoning with all of this evidence that we have. And then you also can't discredit just the fact, again, Simon never outright confessed to it, but she was caught in so many lies so many times. And they had to be wondering what exactly she had to lie about when people that testified in the case said she was the only person involved that had trouble being truthful. And so they had to look at all the evidence, not just one key piece. And for them, it was ultimately enough to convict her of murder.
Now, we also heard from Chatham County Police Chief Jeff Hadley today, the CCPD holding a press conference after the verdict. Now, you'll remember Jeff Hadley has been out in front of this case from the investigative standpoint from the very beginning, leading that search of the landfill for Quinton's remains. Here's a listen to what he had to say.
The amount of work that it takes to do this type of case or to handle this type of case, this is real stuff, folks. You know, this isn't TV, and this isn't 48 hours, and this took gut-wrenching, dirty work, literally and figuratively, to get this done.
Now, that dirty work Chief Hadley is referencing, again, that weeks-long search of the landfill for Quinton Simon's remains. Now, Flynn, you were at that press conference today. What did Hadley have to say about that hard work paying off?
Well, so much was made of the police work from prosecutors during the trial today. I mean, Chief Hadley says this was the biggest case and investigation that CCPD has ever done. He says it's formed some of the culture there and how officers conduct their work. So he talked about a wide range of emotions, saying that he's proud of his officers and what they did, but also that this is having a long-lasting impact on them. He specifically referenced Officer Sophia Zerke, who took the stand, becoming emotional when she discovered what would eventually turn out to be Quinton's remains. He also talked about the police work involved here, and it really seemed to mirror how the prosecution laid out their case of gathering witnesses, gathering that evidence and that cell phone data to kind of eliminate every other possibility and use deductive reasoning to conclude, according to Chief Hadley, that Leilani Simon could be the only person responsible for Quinton's death.
Now, again, this was a massive undertaking, and it wasn't just the Chatham County Police Department. You're also talking about the FBI and the GBI. Chief Hadley touching on that today in the press conference, saying that this all wouldn't have been possible without the help of all of these agencies working together.
But I believed in the work that we did. I believe we did everything that we could do. We left no stone unturned in our ability to present a case to the DA's office for them to prosecute. And I had every belief that they were going to come back with a guilty plea.
Now, many of the people we heard from today, both Parker and Hadley, breathing a sigh of relief, after a 2-week-long trial and 2 years of investigation. What do you guys think the impact is left behind of this trial, and what are your lasting thoughts on verdict day here?
I think I go back to something that Tim Dean said in his closing arguments, which is, look, we know that we have a lack of evidence. We know that there's no manner of death. But if you do not convict her on these charges, Leilani Simon, you are giving her exactly what she wanted. He said, and I quote, "You are bringing her plan to completion." And I think that this was a stand and showing that just because you managed to cover up a crime really, really well, that doesn't mean that you're going to get away with it. And so I think that it also shows the hard work of law enforcement. These things that they had to do were not easy. Searching that landfill was not easy. This could have gone a very different way if Quinton's remains were never recovered, which was absolutely a possibility. The fact that the Chatham County Police Department and the FBI were able to recover his remains, I mean, it's almost unthinkable, the odds that they had to overcome to do that. But also at the end of the day, Simon has gotten her justice, but there's still a 20-month-old that's dead and will never get the life that he was supposed to have. And I think that's going to leave scars on this community.
Yeah, Chief Hadley talked about the impact this case has on the public. You know, this was such a, we were talking with him earlier today in the courtroom, and he said, you know, this case has touched so many people, not just the investigators, but those, you know, who civilian volunteers who took the time to canvass and search for Quinton in October 2022. And he also mentioned the impact that this has on the department and his officers who were involved. Specifically, he gave a shout out to lead detective here, Marion Lemon, saying, you know, even though she's young in her career, she really rose to the challenge. We saw her many times on the stand today. And so, you know, he just kind of put this moment into perspective of this is a case that has gripped not only the local community, but some even nationwide. So many times we've heard people calls for justice for Quinton, and I think today a lot of people got the answers they were looking for. We didn't hear from the defense team. They did not interview. They declined to do so. But we did hear from prosecutors, and I think they are obviously pleased with the outcome of today's verdict.
They're going to sleep easy tonight.
All right, Flynn Snyder, Shay Schrader, thank you so much for your reporting over these past 2 weeks. Stick with us here on this special edition of B News at 7 on Verdict Day. I'll be joined by Jonah Pine for analysis. Stay with us.